Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. Blanche of Bourbon. Introduction. There's a castle in the south of Spain. Thick stone walls, the faint salt of the Atlantic, carried inland on the air. Long corridors of silence. It sits near the town of Medina, Sidonia, deep in Andalusia, in a country of chalk-white hills and ancient olive groves. It was here, in the summer of 1361, that a young woman died. She was about 22 years old. Her name was Blanche of Bourbon. She was at least a name, the Queen of Castile. She had held that title for 8 years. In that time, she had not been permitted to exercise any of its substance. She had not ruled, counseled, or been consulted. She had not traveled her kingdom, received ambassadors, or patronized the arts. She had not even been permitted the most fundamental things a medieval queen was expected to do: bear children and secure the succession. Instead, she spent those 8 years in a series of fortresses, each one a little further south, a little more remote, moved whenever the political winds shifted, in ways that made her presence inconvenient to the man who kept her there. She entered her prison at 14. She left it only in death. Most people who lived and died in medieval Europe left no trace at all. Kings and queens at least left their names and dates. But Blanche of Bourbon left barely more than a name, and even that was immediately obscured by the competing interests that fought over her memory. The chronicles that described her were written by men with deep partisan stakes, loyalists of her husband's enemies, defenders of her husband's reputation, members of a Bourbon dynasty that would later find it useful to remember her as a sanctified martyr of French royal blood. What the historical record gives us is a ghost of a person, a young woman of extraordinary birth and connection, sent into a foreign kingdom as a diplomatic instrument, discarded when the instrument broke, and then silenced, first by imprisonment, then by death, and finally by the indifference of a tradition that found her suffering useful as a symbol, but inconvenient as a fact. Her story persists, not because of what she did. She was given almost no opportunity to do anything, but because of what was done to her, and because the politics of her short life touched nearly every great power in 14th century Europe. To understand Blanche, you must understand France under the Valois kings, Castile under one of the most controversial monarchs in Iberian history, the machinery of dynastic marriage as a diplomatic tool, and the particular cruelty of being a woman whose rank existed primarily to serve the ambitions of men. You must also sit with the essential uncertainty at the center of her story, a woman about whom almost nothing can be said with complete confidence, whose death remains disputed, whose inner life is entirely lost, and whose significance was always more political than personal. Let us start at the beginning of her story. Part 1. The world she was born into. The House of Bourbon in the Capetian Web. Blanche of Bourbon was born in 1339, most likely in or near the royal residence of Vincennes, just east of Paris, the second daughter of a family whose identity was inseparable from the identity of France itself. Her father was Peter I, Duke of Bourbon. The Duchy of Bourbon encompassed the heart of central France, a territory of rolling hills, vineyards, thermal springs, and noble residences spread across what is today the Allier department. The ducal seat was Moulins, and the family also maintained the ancient castle at Bourbon-l'Archambault, a thermal spa town whose warm mineral springs had drawn aristocratic visitors since Roman times. To understand the Bourbons' place in the world, you have to trace their genealogy to the most revered French king of the Middle Ages. The family connection to royalty began in 1272, when Robert, Count of Clermont, the sixth son of King Louis IX of France, the king later canonized as Saint Louis, married Beatrice of Burgundy, the heiress to the lordship of Bourbon. Their son Louis became the first Duke of Bourbon in the early 14th century. This made the Bourbon family not merely allies to the French royalty, but descended from it in the most direct way possible. Blanche's father, Peter I of Bourbon, was Louis's son, and therefore Louis IX's great-grandson, a lineage that carried enormous weight in a world where the blood of a canonized king was almost literally sacred. But the connections went further. Blanche's mother, Isabella of Valois, was the daughter of Charles of Valois, the brother of King Philip IV of France, one of the most formidable monarchs of the medieval era, the man who dissolved the Knights Templar and locked horns repeatedly with Pope Boniface VIII. Through his third wife, Maud of Châtillon, Charles produced Isabella among other children, which meant that Isabella of Valois was the sister of three French kings, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV. Blanche's maternal blood was Valois blood, the blood that would rule France for the next 2.5 centuries. The practical consequence of all this genealogical density is that Blanche occupied at birth a position of extraordinary proximity to the French throne. She was a niece by descent of 3 kings. She was a cousin of John II of France, who was reigning at the time of her marriage. Her eldest sister, Jean, married the future Charles V in 1350, making Blanche sister-in-law to a French king. When the Castilians' envoy arrived in Paris in 1352, looking for a royal bride, they were seeking not just a pretty princess, but this entire web of connection, a living link to the most prestigious royal house in Christendom. The ducal court where Blanche grew up was prosperous and cultivated. The Bourbon dukes were important patrons of the arts and the church, closely allied with their Valois cousins, deeply embedded in the religious and intellectual life of 14th century France. Blanche's upbringing would have followed the standard formation for a noble girl of her rank: regular prayer and religious instruction, the lives of the saints, embroidery, music, courtly manners, and the management of a large household. Whether anyone thought to teach her Spanish, we don't know. The answer was probably no. A queen was expected to absorb her adopted language by immersion, and the formalities of court could always be managed through Latin. Her father, Peter I of Bourbon, spent his adult life in the service of France during one of the most catastrophic periods in French history. He fought at Crécy in 1346, the battle where English longbowmen slaughtered the flower of French chivalry with a lethality that left contemporaries unable to make sense of what had happened. He survived Crécy. He fought in other campaigns through the grinding early decades of the 100 Years' War. And then, in September 1356, he died at the Battle of the Poitiers, another devastating English victory. This one even more humiliating because it ended with the King of France himself taken prisoner. Peter I of Bourbon commanded the 3rd Division of the French armies at Poitiers, positioned in the rear as a reserve. He did not survive the day. His son Louis, 17 years old, became the new Duke of Bourbon. His widow Isabella eventually took religious vows and spent her remaining decades in a Franciscan convent in Paris. Blanche, who had been in Castile for 3 years by then, could not attend her father's funeral. She would never see any of her family again. The Black Death in the Century of Crisis. Blanche's story cannot be understood apart from the broader texture of the world that produced it, because the 14th century was not merely a politically busy period. It was one of the most catastrophic eras in European history. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had already weakened European populations before Blanche was born. Then, in the autumn of 1347, Genoese trading ships docked at Messina in Sicily with a cargo that included Yersinia pestis, a bacterium we call bubonic plague. The Black Death swept through Europe with a speed and lethality that contemporaries were simply unable to process. Entire villages emptied. Gravediggers could not keep pace with the dead. The church, which was supposed to explain suffering and offer comfort, found itself offering only more funerals. Flagellant processions moved through the towns of Germany and France, men beating themselves publicly in an attempt to appease a god who seemed, by all available evidence, to have abandoned his creation. Modern historians estimate that the plague killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population in some regions. Blanche was born before the plague arrived, but she grew up in its aftermath, in a world marked by depopulation, labor shortages, social disruption, and a pervasive sense of instability that reached even the most prosperous households. It is no accident that the 14th century gave Europe the dance of death as a cultural form, the figure of death leading people of all ranks, from pope to peasants, in an irresistible procession toward the grave. Everyone in Blanche's world had lost people. Everyone carried, in whatever way they could, the knowledge that life was fragile and arbitrary and could end without warning. This context matters for understanding political marriages like Blanche's. The urgency with which dynasties sought to secure their lines through strategic unions was not merely about power in the abstract. It was about survival in a world where plague could wipe out entire family branches in a season. The pressure to send daughters across continents, to marry children before they could meaningfully consent, to sacrifice individual welfare for collective security. All of this was intensified by the precariousness of 14th century life. This does not excuse what happened to Blanche, but it contextualizes it. France and Castile. To understand why a French princess was sent to marry a Spanish king, you have to think about the strategic geography of Western Europe in the 1350s. France and England were locked in the sustained, brutal opening phase of the Hundred Years' War. The English crown held vast territories in France through inheritance and conquest, and claimed the French throne itself, a claim Edward III had pressed aggressively since 1337. France was fighting not just for territory, but for its existence as an independent kingdom. In this context, Castile mattered in ways that are not always immediately obvious. It was the dominant Christian kingdom of Spain, larger in territory and population than its neighbors, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal, and possessed of a substantial fleet operating out of ports on both the Cantabrian coast in the north and the Andalusian Atlantic coast in the south. A Castilian fleet allied with France would give the French a naval capability they needed badly, with the ability to operate in the Bay of Biscay and threaten English sea lanes. The same fleet allied with England, or even merely neutral, would negate that advantage entirely. France was also fighting from a position of persistent internal weakness. The plague had devastated the population. The campaigns of the 1340s and 1350s had killed much of the nobility and drained the treasury. After Poitiers in 1356, France was paying a ransom of 3 million gold écus for the return of its captured king, while simultaneously managing a major peasant revolt, the Jacquerie of 1358, that shook the social order of northern France to its foundation. In this context, securing Castile's alliance through marriage was not merely desirable, it was a strategic imperative. When the Castilian envoy arrived at the French court in 1352, they were pushing on an open door. John II and his advisors were eager for a treaty that would bind Castile to France and denied the Castilian fleet to England. Blanche of Bourbon, young, healthy, beautiful by all accounts, and connected to the French crown through a double Valois-Bourbon ancestry that no Castilians could fail to appreciate, was the obvious candidate. She was, in the cold logic of the moment, perfect. Part 2. The king she was sent to marry. Peter of Castile. Peter I of Castile was born on August 30th, 1334, in the monastery of Santa Maria la Real de las Huelgas in Burgos, the great Cistercian royal monastery that had served as the burial church of the Castilian royal family for generations. His father was Alfonso XI, one of the more capable Iberian kings of the era, who had won the Battle of Rio Salado in 1340 against a Moroccan invasion, and who died of a plague in 1350 while besieging Gibraltar. His mother was Maria of Portugal. He was Alfonso's only legitimate son. That phrase, only legitimate son, is the key to everything about Peter's reign. Alfonso XI had also fathered at least 10 recognized illegitimate children by his famous mistress, Leonor de Guzman, an Andalusian noblewoman of exceptional intelligence and beauty who had been his companion for roughly 20 years. Their relationship was public and unashamed. Leonor and her sons lived at court, received titles and lands, and functioned in practice as a quasi-royal family parallel to Alfonso's legitimate queen and her single son. The sons of Leonor, particularly Henry, the eldest, who held the county of Trastamara, grew up with expectations of position and importance. When Alfonso died and left a 15-year-old legitimate king on the throne, those expectations became ambitions, and those ambitions became the defining thread of Peter's reign. Peter's first act as king was to order the arrest and execution of Leonor de Guzman. She was taken to the castle of Talavera de la Reina and beheaded. The act was emotionally comprehensible. Leonor represented everything that had humiliated Peter's mother and complicated his own legitimacy, and politically catastrophic because it gave Henry of Trastamara and his brothers a grievance that was simultaneously personal and irresolvable. A dead mother is a permanent grievance. They would spend the rest of their lives seeking revenge. The chronicler Pedro Lopez de Ayala, the primary source for Peter's reign, described the king in terms that are physically vivid: tall for his era at around 6 feet, muscular, pale complexioned with blue eyes, and very light blonde hair, features more Nordic than typically Castilian. He lisped slightly. He worked long hours and late into the night. He was multilingual, reportedly fluent in Andalusi, Arabic, as well as Castilian and Latin. He loved music and poetry. He wore Moorish dress at court and employed Muslim horsemen in his royal guard and Jewish scholars in his treasury and administration. This last set of facts was weaponized against him by his enemies, who accused him of being a crypto-Muslim, a friend to Jews and Saracens, a king whose cultural habits betrayed his unfitness to lead a Christian realm in the age of Reconquista. These accusations should be recognized for what they were: propaganda. Castile in the mid-14th century was a genuinely pluralistic kingdom in which Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities had coexisted, in varying degrees of tension and mutual accommodations for centuries. Peter's reliance on Jewish and Muslim administrators reflected the actual human geography of his kingdom. His most famous architectural legacy, the Palacio de Don Pedro within the Alcazar of Seville, was built by craftsmen from Granada and Toledo in the Mudéjar style, a breathtaking palace that chose the aesthetic of the south over the Gothic fashions of the north, and that stands today as one of the most beautiful buildings in Europe. His government was, in certain ways, notably modern for its time. He relied heavily on non-noble administrators, centralized royal authority, and worked to limit the power of the great lords who had long operated with quasi-independent control over their regions. To the merchants, artisans, and townspeople who depended on stable royal authority, Peter was El Justiciero, the executor of justice, the strong king who kept the roads safe. Even Ayala, who was no friend to Peter's memory, admitted that when Peter fell, many common people mourned him, because under his rule, the nobility had been held in check and ordinary life had been relatively secure. To the great lords, however, he was El Cruel, a tyrant who enforced his will through murder, who executed nobles without adequate judicial process, who used terror as an instrument of statecraft. Both images were real. Both were incomplete. Peter was a man of his century and his circumstances, a young king who came to power under existential threat, who knew from adolescence that his half-brothers wanted his throne, and who understood that any sign of weakness would be exploited. His violence was often preemptive, striking before traitors could act. His enemies called this murder. His defenders called it survival. Looking back from our distance, it was probably both. The historian's dilemma with Peter is sharpened by a particular fact. The man who wrote the most detailed account of his reign, Ayala, defected to the enemy side in 1366 and wrote his chronicle under Trastamaran patronage after Henry had won. This does not mean Ayala lied about everything. It means his account must be read with constant awareness of his position. The chronicles of the victors are not neutral documents, and almost nothing we know about Blanche of Bourbon arrived through channels that had any reason to treat her fairly. María de Padilla, the woman who changed everything. There is no way to understand what happened to Blanche without first understanding María de Padilla, the woman Peter actually loved. María was born around 1334 in the province of Burgos in the northern Castilian plateau. Her father was Juan Garcia de Padilla, Lord of Villa Garcia. Her family occupied the tier of regional nobility, not the grandees, but respectable, landed people with good connections to the administrative and military world of Castile. Her maternal uncle, Juan Fernández de Hinestrosa, eventually rise to Grand Master of the Order of Calatrava, one of the three great military order of the Iberian Peninsula. Contemporary chronicles describe Maria in terms that are unusually specific, very beautiful, intelligent, and small of body. That last detail, the observation about her physical stature, is the kind of particular that usually gets lost in medieval descriptions of women, which tended toward the generic and the conventional. Its survival suggests that chroniclers were drawing on real observation and actual memory rather than literary formula. She was, by all accounts, a genuinely exceptional person, not merely a beautiful woman who caught a king's eye, but someone of real intelligence and force, whose hold on Peter went far deeper than physical attraction. Peter met Maria in the summer of 1352, when he was on campaign in Asturias against his half-brother's ongoing rebellion. She was probably introduced through her uncle, Hinestrosa. Whatever the exact circumstances, the attraction was immediate, and the relationship quickly became absolute. Peter's chief advisor and court favorite, Juan Alfonso de Albuquerque, had initially encouraged the liaison, calculating that a royal mistress from a family he could influence would increase his own power over the young king. This turned out to be one of the most consequential miscalculations of 14th century Castilian politics. Rather than remaining a manageable attachment, Maria became the emotional center of Peter's universe. Her family rose to compete directly with Albuquerque's faction for the king's favor, and the entire architecture of the favorite's influence collapsed. By 1353, Peter and Maria had been together for about a year. She was pregnant with their first child. He would later claim after her death that he had secretly married her on June 24th, 1353, making her his true and only legitimate wife, their children his rightful heirs, and his marriage to Blanche of Bourbon legally void from the beginning. No contemporary source corroborates this claim. It appears only in accounts produced after Maria died, when Peter had strong political reasons to assert it. Most historians regard it as a posthumous fabrication, though the question cannot be definitively resolved. What is not in question is that Peter was deeply, unshakably devoted to María de Padilla, and that when his mother and his council pressed him to marry Blanche for political reasons, he agreed only under duress, with profound reluctance and with no intention whatsoever of giving up the woman he considered his true partner. This is not a story of a king who simply could not control himself. Peter was 18 years old, surrounded by enemies, forced into a marriage he didn't want, and María de Padilla may have been the one stable and genuine attachment in a life that had otherwise been a sustained exercise in mistrust. His loyalty to her was total, but for Blanche, it was devastating. Part 3. The Negotiations and the Journey. The Marriage Contract. The formal negotiations for Blanche's marriage began in 1352. Two Castilian envoys arrived at the French court with the proposal, and the French accepted quickly. They had strategic urgency. Blanche was selected over her elder sister Jeanne, who was already promised to the future Charles V. The marriage contract was elaborate and detailed, as befitted a union of this political weight. The dowry was set at 300,000 gold florins, an enormous sum. Payment was structured in installments, 25,000 florins upon Blanche's arrival in Castile, another 25,000 at the first Christmas following the marriage, and then 50,000 florins at each of the 5 subsequent Christmases. In exchange, Blanche was to receive as her personal holdings the Castilian town of Arevalo, Sepulveda, Coca, and Majorca, a substantial portfolio of territories with their associated revenues and jurisdictions, the kind of independent economic base that would allow a queen to maintain her own household. One clause in the contract is quietly revealing. If Blanche died without an heir, the assigned territories would revert to the crown. Her value to Castile was as a living, reproducing symbol of the Franco-Castilian alliance. If she ceased to perform that function, through death or failure to produce children, the arrangement would be undone. The contract treated her, in formal legal language, as an instrument. Peter signed the contract on November 4, 1352. The proxy wedding, performed in Blanche's absence at the Abbaye des Prés, had taken place in July of that year. Blanche's departure was delayed until January 1353. Multiple sources record that she refused the marriage on 3 separate occasions before finally accepting under pressure from King John II, her father, her brother-in-law, and her sister Jeanne. 3 refusals, then capitulation. She was 14 years old, and the adults around her treated her reluctance as a minor obstacle to be overcome rather than a meaningful preference to be respected. The preparations for her journey were lavish, a public demonstration of the French crown's investment in the alliance. Her trousseau is partially preserved in the historical record. She traveled with 12 trunks and 6 leather-coated baskets. Her possession included a gold crown set with gems valued at 3,200 escudos and a tiara containing 12 rubies, 20 emeralds, 16 diamonds, and 40 large pearls valued at 2,560 libras. religious objects, ceremonial clothing, household goods, all of it carefully packed for a journey that would take months and that was, as it turned out, entirely one way. Blanche of Bourbon would never see France again. The road south. The route from France to Castile in the mid-14th century was not simple. The party traveled south through the Languedoc and Provence, stopping first at Avignon, where Blanche was received by Pope Innocent VI. The papal court had been located in Avignon since 1309, when Clement V moved it from Rome in what critics called the Babylonian captivity of the church. The papacy would remain there until 1377, a 70-year residency on French soil that gave it enormous cultural and financial connections to France, but also compromised its independence in ways that mattered greatly to the people who needed it most, as Blanche would discover. Innocent VI, who had been pope since 1352, was a Limousin Frenchman, and his reception of the young Bourbon princess was warm. This meeting between a 14-year-old girl and the most powerful religious figure in the world has a particular poignancy. Whatever he recognized in her situation, and perhaps he saw more than the diplomatic record suggests, Innocent VI would become one of the very few voices in European high politics who consistently, if ineffectually, advocated for Blanche's welfare in the years that followed. He would appeal to Peter, make representations through diplomatic channels, urge her release. He would never be heeded, but the fact that he tried when almost no one else did is worth noting. From Avignon, the party crossed the Pyrenees, not a trivial crossing in January, and reached Barcelona in late January or early February 1353. Barcelona was then under the crown of Aragon, a separate kingdom with its own dynasty and its own complicated relationship with Castile. The journey through Aragonese territory on the way to a Castilian wedding was itself a small act of political navigation, a reminder of the web of rivalries that surrounded every royal marriage of the period. Blanche arrived in Valladolid in February 1353. Valladolid was the principal seat of the Castilian court, a prosperous city on the Pisuerga River in the northern plateau, where the Cortes met and where the rhythm of the Castilian political life was most concentrated. Queen Mother Maria of Portugal came to greet her. Peter did not. He was 250 miles away in Cordoba, waiting for María de Padilla to give birth to their daughter Beatrice. The message was unmistakable to everyone paying attention. A king who left his arriving bride, the cousin of the French king, the centerpiece of the diplomatic alliance his own advisors had spent months constructing, waiting in Valladolid, while he attended the birth of his mistress's child, was a king broadcasting his priorities with painful clarity. He came to Valladolid eventually, after Beatrice had been born and provided for. He came for the wedding. 2 days later, he was gone. The wedding and its immediate aftermath. The wedding was held on June 3rd, 1353, in Valladolid. Despite everything, it was celebrated with the pomp appropriate to the wedding of a king to a princess of France. Blanche was 14. Peter was 18. Queen Mother Maria of Portugal watched from what must have been an anxious vantage point She had been the driving force behind the marriage and presumably understood even then how thin the fiction of festivity was. Some accounts record that Blanche's escort for Narbonne, Peter's bastard brother, Frederic Alfonso, had conducted an improper relationship with her during the journey, and that Peter used this alleged betrayal as his justification for abandoning her. This story appears primarily in sources hostile to Blanche and served too neatly as an excuse to be accepted without scrutiny. It may be rumor that Peter encouraged. It may be a story invented wholesale. What it illustrates is the kind of rhetorical move always available to a powerful man who needs to explain his cruelty in socially acceptable terms, accuse the woman of dishonor, and her mistreatment becomes a matter of masculine dignity rather than a royal tyranny. 2 days after the ceremony, some sources say 3, Peter left and returned to María de Padilla. He was brought back by his mother and council, who pleaded, urged, and possibly threatened. He stayed for 2 more days, and then, in Aya's words, he never saw the Queen Donna Blanche, his wife, again. The political fallout was immediate. John II of France had sent only the first installment of the dowry, 25,000 florins, and the subsequent payments were not arriving. Peter interpreted this as French bad faith. France interpreted Peter's abandonment of Blanche as Castilian bad faith. Both sides had genuine grievances. Neither had a mechanism for resolving them. Blanche was caught in the middle of a dispute between 2 kings, each of whom was using her as evidence of the other's treachery, and neither had any genuine intention of prioritizing her welfare. Part 4. The Long Imprisonment. Arevalo, Toledo, in the politics of captivity. Blanche's imprisonment was not immediate and absolute from the moment Peter left Valladolid. The months following the wedding were chaotic, with various court factions arguing over what should happen to the abandoned queen. Queen Mother Maria and the disgraced favorite Albuquerque insisted Peter must honor his vows. Peter's bastard brothers, Henry of Trastamara, and his siblings, aligned themselves with Blanche's cause, not from any genuine concern for her welfare, but because her mistreatment gave them a morally resonant grievance to deploy against the half-brother they wanted to dethrone. Blanche of Bourbon became, in this period, simultaneously a victim and a political banner, a real person suffering real harm, and a symbol whose suffering was being instrumentalized by everyone around her. Peter responded to this pressure by trying to dissolve the marriage entirely. He claimed the union was void, citing non-consummation and his alleged prior marriage to María de Padilla, and in a remarkable act of matrimonial improvisation, married a third woman, Juana de Castro, whose family connections he wanted to secure politically. A compliant bishop performed the ceremony. Peter spent 2 nights with Juana, then returned to María de Padilla, abandoning this third marriage as thoroughly as he abandoned the second. The church did not recognize the annulment of his marriage to Blanche, making the union with Juana canonically null. It left both Juana and Blanche in a strange legal suspension. But for Blanche, suspension was just another word for prison. By 1354 or 1355, Peter had reasserted firm control over the Castilian political situation. The rebel noble faction was suppressed and scattered. Albuquerque fled to Portugal, where he died. The bastard brothers retreated. Blanche, who had briefly come under the protection of factions opposed to Peter and attracted significant popular sympathy, there is an account preserved in older sources of her crying out from the steps of the Toledo Cathedral while the townspeople of the city rallied to her. Moved by her beauty and her evident distress, was now firmly in Peter's custody. She was imprisoned in the castle of Arevalo. The irony of Arevalo is worth noting. It was one of the towns explicitly named in Blanche's marriage contract as her personal property, a place she was supposed to own and administer as part of her queenly endowment, a source of income and local authority that would have given her some measure of real power. Instead, it became her prison. The properties meant to give her agency became the instruments of her confinement. From Arevalo, she was eventually moved to the Alcazar of Toledo. Toledo is one of the great cities of Iberian history. An ancient Visigothic capital, later an important center of Moorish learning and culture, perched on a dramatic rocky promontory in the bend of the Tagus River, its skyline dominated by the great Gothic cathedral begun in 1226. The Alcazar was a major royal fortress palace, one of the most important residences in the kingdom. That Blanche was held there gives her imprisonment a peculiar quality. She was kept in places of royal prestige, as if the fiction of her queenship could be maintained through the grandeur of her surroundings, even as every actual element of queenly life was denied to her. The years of imprisonment are almost entirely silent in the historical record. No political papers, no correspondence, no documented friendships or patronage relationships, no documented anything. This silence is itself a historical fact of significance. Medieval women of Blanche's rank, who had the freedom to act, who could commission artworks, write letters, manage estates, receive visitors, correspond with other royals, left traces in the record. Blanche denied all of this, left almost none. She appears in the sources only when her situation becomes politically relevant to someone else. When the French crown appealed to the Pope, when Peter tried to have the marriage annulled, when the bastard brothers invoked her name as a cause. She is a reflection in other people's documents. Her own voice is gone. What we can say with confidence is that her physical conditions of confinement were probably tolerable in material terms. Keeping a queen in degrading physical conditions would have been a diplomatic provocation with no benefit to Peter. She almost certainly had attendance, religious observance, adequate food and clothing. The prison was psychological and political rather than physical. A denial of freedom, agency, connection, and the basic fulfillment of the only role she had ever been trained for. 8 years passed in this suspension. 8 years of watching the world continue through whatever windows her various fortresses offered, unable to participate in it, unable to change it, unable to leave. The world's indifference. Throughout these years, the question of Blanche's fate surfaced occasionally in European diplomatic correspondence, then sank again beneath more pressing concerns. Her cousin, King John II of France, appealed to Pope Innocent VI to have Peter excommunicated for keeping his wife imprisoned, a serious step since excommunication released the king's subject from their oath of loyalty and made him a pariah in the Christian community. Innocent VI declined. The refusal reflects the papacy's own precarious position. The Avignon papacy was deeply dependent on French goodwill. It was located in France, staffed predominantly by French clergy, and financially vulnerable to French political pressure. But excommunicating the King of Castile might have pushed him toward an English alliance, the very outcome France most feared. The same strategic logic that produced Blanche's marriage now operated to prevent the papacy from defending her. Her welfare was simply outweighed by larger calculations of power. This is the pattern that would repeat throughout her captivity. There was always something more important. John II of France was, in any case, in no position to press the matter harder. He was fighting the 100 Years' War. He dealt with the catastrophe of the Poitiers in 1356, where he was captured by the English. He spent years in captivity, negotiating a ransom. He eventually returned voluntarily to English custody when one of his hostages escaped, an act of medieval honor that his contemporaries admired, and that left him in practical terms a king in exile. France under John II was a kingdom in sustained crisis. In Blanche of Bourbon, however much her situation troubled the conscience of those who knew about it, was not a priority. John II died in English captivity in 1364. His son Charles V, Blanche's brother-in-law, who had married his sister Jean, eventually took a harder line against Peter of Castile, but Charles' hostility was driven by the broader Franco-English contest, not by any belated desire to avenge his imprisoned sister-in-law. He funded Henry of Trastamara's campaign, employed Bertrand du Guesclin to lead them, and contributed substantially to the chain of events that eventually killed Peter at Montiel in 1369. None of this was done for Blanche. She was 8 years dead by the time the decisive phase of the struggle began. Part 5. The End at Medina Sidonia. The Last Transfer. By 1361, the dynamics around Blanche had shifted enough to make her physical location a matter of active strategic concern. The War of the Two Peters, the long conflict between Peter I of Castile and Peter IV of Aragon, had been grinding on since 1356, with Aragon consistently supporting the Trastamaran cause. There was a real possibility that forces from Aragon or France might attempt to liberate the imprisoned queen and use her as a legitimizing symbol for a coalition against Peter. To prevent this, he ordered Blanche transferred to Medina Sidonia, far south deep in Andalusia, near the Atlantic coast between Cadiz and Seville. Medina Sidonia is an ancient hilltop town in the province of Cadiz. Whitewashed buildings, cork oak forest, the particular hot silence of a southern Andalusian summer. It was as far as possible from the northern and eastern frontiers, where Peter's enemies were most active, as far from France and Aragon as a Castilian location could be. The strategic logic of the choice is transparent. Move her somewhere so remote that even those who wished to help her would find the logistics overwhelming. The castle that held her came to be known in later tradition as the Castillo di Donna Blanca, her name given to her prison. Also in 1361, in July, María de Padilla died in Seville. She was about 27. The cause was almost certainly plague, still periodically sweeping through Castile in those years. Peter's grief was genuine and profound. Maria had been the emotional center of his life for nearly a decade. She had bore him 4 children. Whatever her formal legal status, he had been, in every practical sense, the most important person in his world. Her death immediately set off a political maneuver. Peter appeared before the Cortes of Castile and declared that he had secretly married Maria before his union with Blanche, that this prior marriage made his Bourbon marriage void from the very beginning, and that Maria's children were therefore legitimate heirs to the throne. He produced witnesses. The Cortes, under considerable pressure, recognized the children's legitimacy. Peter's son, Alfonso, was designated heir, though the boy would die in 1362 at about 3 years old. For this legitimization to hold, Blanche of Bourbon needed to be definitively out of the picture. As long as she lived, she remained Peter's canonically legitimate wife in the eyes of the Church and most European powers. The claim that Maria was the true wife could be asserted, but it remained contested, and a contested succession was exactly what Peter's weakened position could not sustain. The timing of Blanche's death, coming just weeks after Maria's, in the same summer, at a remote location in the far south of the kingdom, could not have failed to seem to observers like more than a coincidence. The Mystery of Medina Sidonia. Blanche of Bourbon died in August 1361 in Medina Sidonia. The date given in most sources is August 26th. She was about 22 years old, and almost everything else about her death, how it happened, who was responsible, and whether it was even a killing at all, has been contested from that summer to this one. Think about what that means. A queen of Castile died in a royal fortress under the custody of the king's own men, and no one could agree on what happened. Not in 1361, not in 1379 when the first chronicle was written, not in the centuries of historical argument that followed. The fog around her death was not accidental. It was manufactured by people with urgent reasons to shape the story in ways that served them, and that manufacturing makes the truth not just unknown, but perhaps permanently unknowable. To understand why, you need to understand the person who controls the record, a man named Pedro Lopez de Ayala. Ayala was born in 1332 into one of the great aristocratic families of Castile. He served Peter I, actually served him as a courtier and military officer for much of the king's reign. He commanded part of the Castilian fleet in 1359. He was present at many of the events he later described. He was, in other words, an eyewitness. And then, in 1366, he defected. When Henry of Trastamara's forces swept across Castile that year, and most of the nobility abandoned Peter, Ayala went with them. He spent the remainder of his very long career, he died in 1407, in the service of the Trastamara dynasty, rising eventually to become royal chancellor of Castile. His chronicle of Peter's reign was begun around 1379 at Enrique II's request, and was explicitly intended to legitimize the new dynasty's claim to power. The chronicle went through not one but 2 versions. The first, what scholars call version primitiva, was composed under Enrique II. The second, the version vulgar, was significantly revised under his successor, with material rearranged, deleted, and added in ways that adapted the narrative to shifting political needs. According to modern scholarship, in the Journal of Medieval Iberian Studies, Ayala rewrote the chronicle to adapt to the changing historical, political, and literary context of each reign, and the differences between the two versions reflect the political program of Enrique II and his immediate descendants. This is not a stable source. It is a living document of political justification revised at least once with deliberate purpose. Britannica, it describes Ayala as generally reliable because he was a witness, and that reliability is real as far as it goes. He was present for many events and records, specific details that carried the ring of genuine observation. But the chronicle's central purpose was to justify a regicide. Every narrative choice, every emphasis, every damning anecdote serves that purpose. Understanding what Ayala knew from what he shaped requires constant vigilance, and nowhere is that vigilance more necessary than in the passage about Blanche's death. The crossbow account, Ayala's version. The most detailed narrative of Blanche's death comes from Ayala's chronicle, and it is worth reconstructing carefully because its details are the source of what most subsequent writers have said. According to Ayala, the sequence unfolded in 3 stages. First, Peter sent a physician named Alfonso de Perosa to Medina Sidonia with instructions to poison Blanche. Perosa refused. The reasons for his refusals are not explained in the chronicle. It may have been conscience, or it may have been the self-preserving calculation that poisoning a queen was not a crime a physician could expect to survive the discovery of. Either way, Perosa declined, and the physician's refusal is the first detail that gives Ayala's account an unusual texture. It suggests that not everyone around Peter was willing to carry out unlimited violence, that there was a moral threshold even within the king's circle of servants. The second stage, Peter instructed Inigo Ortiz de Estúñiga, the nobleman responsible for guarding Blanche at Medina Sidonia, to kill her directly. Estúñiga also refused. He reportedly told the king that the act was treasonous and likely to cause disorder in the kingdom. Peter, the chronicle records, was furious. The second refusal is even more striking than the first, because Estúñiga was a nobleman of rank, not a hired physician. His refusal was a direct statement about the limits of what a loyal subject owed to his king. Killing a queen, even an inconvenient one, was a step too far. The kingdom's order depended on certain prohibitions being observed, and the murder of a queen was one of them. The third stage, Peter had Blanche transferred to a crossbowman from Jerez de la Frontera named Juan Perez de Roboledo, and Roboledo carried out the execution. He shot her with his crossbow. Roboledo was later arrested and under torture confessed to the killing. He was then executed in Seville in the most extreme manner available, dragged through the streets, quartered, and burned. Ayala notably attributes this execution itself to Peter's desire to silence the only man who could testify to what had happened, killing the killer to bury the evidence. The account is vivid, procedurally specific, and internally coherent in the way that either genuine memory or skilled fabrication can be. 2 named individuals refused the royal command. A third named individual obeyed. All 3 are identifiable people, not generic figures. The disposal of Reboledo is described with the kind of procedural detail that feels like something a court insider might have known. Ayala himself was part of that court world. He could plausibly have had access to this kind of information. There is a textual problem that complicates this account significantly. Different manuscripts of Ayala's chronicle do not say exactly the same thing about Blanche's death. One variant, present in some versions of the text and noted by the 16th century annotator Hieronymo de Zurita, states that Blanche was poisoned by herbs, with no mention of a crossbow at all. This phrasing was repeated by later historian Juan de Mariana in his own account of the events. So Ayala's chronicle, the foundational source, is itself inconsistent. In some versions she is shot, in others she is poisoned. The text that has been passed down to us is not a single fixed document, but a manuscript tradition with variations. And the variations in the most important passage of all are not small. They describe fundamentally different methods of killing. There is also a geographic problem. Reboledo is identified in Ayala as a crossbowman from Jerez de la Frontera, not from Medina Sidonia. Some scholars have noted that Blanche died in Medina Sidonia, but was apparently buried, initially, in the convent of San Francisco in Jerez, and the epitaph on her tomb at that convent is where the famous Latin inscription survives. This proximity to Jerez may reflect nothing more than the practical logistics of burying a queen. Jerez was a larger town with more established religious house, but it has led some commentators to question whether Reboledo is entirely reliable, and whether the geographic confusion in the sources reflects genuine uncertainty about where and how the killing occurred. The poison variant, French account, and herbal murder. Running alongside Ayala's crossbow narrative is a separate and apparently independent tradition that attributes Blanche's death to poisoning, specifically to herbs or poisons administered over time rather than a single violent act. French sources hostile to Peter and later historians drawing on them tend towards this version. It is in many ways more politically and practically plausible than the crossbow account. Poison was the standard instrument of politically sensitive killings in medieval Europe, precisely because it was quiet, deniable, and could mimic natural causes in an era before forensic medicine. A slow poisoning would have been far harder to trace, far less dramatic, and far less likely to produce a confessor who would later be interrogated. If Peter wanted Blanche dead and wanted a death to pass as illness, poison administered by someone in her household would have been the obvious method. One French-influenced account adds a further variant entirely absent from Ayala. Some French historian claim that Peter ordered 2 Jews to murder Blanche. This detail appears in sources clearly shaped by the anti-Petrine propaganda that characterized Peter as a king of Jews, the same propaganda his enemies used to delegitimize him by associating him with Castile's Jewish community. It should be treated with great skepticism as a specific claim, since it seems designed primarily to amplify the existing narrative of Peter's moral and religious unfitness, rather than to report an independent verified act. But its existence is itself significant. It shows how many competing versions of this death are circulating, each shaped by a different propagandistic purpose, and none obviously more authoritative than the others. The variant about herbal poisoning is harder to dismiss precisely because it appears within Ayala's own chronicle tradition rather than in obviously hostile French sources. It suggests that even among those who accepted that Blanche was killed, there was no settled account of how. The method was as disputed as the act itself. The natural death argument. Contemporary and later defenders of Peter offered a categorically different account of what happened at Medina Sidonia. Sarita, the 16th century historian who annotated and amended Ayala's chronicle, noted explicitly that partisans of the king called it a natural death. This observation is significant precisely because Sarita was himself working with Ayala's text and saw the murder narrative firsthand, and he still felt obliged to record that contemporaries disputed. Pro-Petrine sources argued that Blanche died of illness, plague, tuberculosis, or the general physical deterioration of someone who had spent 8 years confined in a series of Castilian fortresses. This last possibility is not as fanciful as it might seem. The year 1361 was a genuine plague year. María de Padilla, young and presumably much better cared for than Blanche, also died that summer, almost certainly of plague. The sweating sickness, tuberculosis, and various fevers were chronic killers of the period, and someone living in restricted circumstances, limited movement, potentially inadequate nutrition, chronic stress, and no access to the best available medical attention would have been more vulnerable than most. Modern scientific assessment has suggested tuberculosis as the most likely diagnosis for Blanche's death, if natural causes are accepted. Tuberculosis in the 14th century was endemic, incurable, and killed slowly, which would explain a decline observed over time rather than a sudden dramatic death. The pro-Petrine argument also targeted the timeline of the accusations. The most lurid and detailed version of the murder narrative appeared in Ayala's chronicle, which was written under Trastamaran patronage, a minimum of 18 years after Blanche's death. The political unity of the murder story, as justification for Henry's regicide and as evidence of Peter's monstrousness, was immense. If the story had been straightforwardly true and widely known, why had it not been trumpeted louder and sooner? Why did it take nearly 2 decades and a change of dynasty to produce a full account of what was supposed to have been an executed queen, a confessing crossbowman, and a subsequent cover-up execution in Seville? The defenders also argued that the church had effectively declared Blanche's marriage to Peter null as early as April 1354, when bishops of Avila and Salamanca had ruled on the non-consummation and Peter's prior bond with María de Padilla. If the marriage was void, Blanche was not Peter's queen in any canonical sense, and her confinement was a legal custody arrangement rather than the imprisonment of a monarch's wife. Her death, in this reading, was the quiet end of a woman who had been a pawn in a diplomatic game, held in comfortable circumstances appropriate to her rank, and who simply died, as people died constantly in the 14th century, of something entirely ordinary. What the evidence actually tells us. The honest reckoning with all of this leads to a set of conclusions that are genuinely unsatisfying, in the way that history often is when it refuses to resolve into a clean verdict. Ayala's chronicle, is the foundational source, and it says Blanche was killed. But Ayala's chronicle exists in multiple manuscript versions that disagree about how she was killed, crossbow in some, poison in others, which means the foundational source is internally contradicted. Ayala was an eyewitness to the broader events of Peter's reign, but he was writing his chronicle under Trastamaran patronage, at minimum 18 years after the fact, with a clear political mandate to construct a portrait of Peter the Cruel. He was also, by 1379, not writing a first draft, but a political document that he would later revise again. The scholar quoted in the Journal of Medieval Iberian Studies observes that this chronicle was explicitly designed to legitimize Enrique II's right to the crown, and Ayala revised it further to adapt to the changing political programs of subsequent Trastamaran kings. This is not a neutral historical record. It is a living instrument of political legitimization. The French and pro-Trastamaran sources that repeat and amplify the murder narrative have an even more obvious motivation. The specific French claim that Jews carried out the killing is transparently propaganda. The poisoning variants add confusion rather than clarification. The epitaph on Blanche's tomb in Jerez, placed there during the 19th century, when Spain was ruled by the Bourbon monarchy, states that she died by the order of her husband Peter the Cruel. But a 19th century Bourbon commissioned inscription is not a medieval source. It is a political commemoration, retroactive, verdict rendering by a dynasty with skin in the game. The pro-Petron sources are no more reliable in the other direction. The claim that the marriage was validly annulled and that Blanche's death was simply natural requires accepting a version of events in which the most convenient death imaginable just happened to occur at the most convenient possible moment, with no foul play and no one responsible. It requires ignoring the specific pattern of Peter's documented behavior, his willingness to use lethal violence against political inconveniences throughout his reign, and accepting that in this one instance, remarkably, he simply waited and nature obliged him. There is also the structural problem that no independent evidence, no papal bulls, no Bourbon family correspondence, no Aragonese diplomatic record noting the Queen's declining health survives to corroborate either side. Blanche was isolated. The isolation that had served to keep her from potential rescuers also served to ensure that no outside witness had regular access to her condition. Whatever happened in Medina Sidonia in August 1361, it happened in a context of almost total information control by the man who had the most to gain from her death. Clara Estro's assessment in Pedro the Cruel of Castile that Blanche functioned primarily as a symbolic figure in dynastic propaganda, and that the accounts of her death are too thoroughly contaminated to yield recoverable truth, is the most intellectually honest position available. It is not satisfying. History rarely is, when it asks you to set aside the desire for a clean resolution and simply sits with the uncertainty. What can be said with confidence is this: a 22-year-old queen died alone in a remote Andalusian castle in August 1361, weeks after the death of the woman who had replaced her, just before the king who kept her there declared his prior marriage to that woman and moved to legitimize their children. The timing was impeccable. If you were Peter, the circumstances ensured that no one would be watching, and the record of what actually happened was immediately shaped by people who needed it to say particular things. Whether she was shot with a crossbow, slowly poisoned, dead of plague, or consumed by years of grief and confinement in a stone room far from France, we cannot say. The mystery of Medina Sidonia has held for 660 years. It will probably hold forever. And there is something fitting about that, given how thoroughly everything else about Blanche of Bourbon was denied a clear account. Her marriage, her queenship, her years of captivity, and now her death. She was never permitted to be fully seen. Part 6. What came after? The fall of Peter the Cruel. Peter survived Blanche by 8 years, and those years moved steadily toward his bloody end. The War of the Two Peters continued through the early 1360s, with Peter winning most engagements but unable to force Aragon to submit. Then, in 1365, Charles V of France made his decisive move. He authorized and largely funded a military expedition under Bertrand du Guesclin, one of the most celebrated soldiers in Europe, to invade Castile on Henry of Trastamara's behalf. Du Guesclin commanded the Free Companies, bands of experienced mercenary soldiers who had been roaming France since the uneasy peace of the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360. Charles was solving two problems at once, redirecting a domestic security threat out of France, while advancing his foreign policy goal of replacing Peter with a king more sympathetic to French interests. Peter, faced with this invasion in 1366, found himself abandoned by most of the Castilian nobility. He retreated from Burgos, then from Toledo, from the great Madeja palace he had built with such care, and then from Seville. He fled to Portugal, where Peter I of Portugal received him with the cold courtesy appropriate to an embarrassing relative. He then crossed to Gascony and appealed to Edward the Black Prince, the son of Edward III of England, and one of the most celebrated military figures of the age. The Black Prince agreed to restore Peter to his throne in exchange for territorial concessions and financial payments. He brought his brother John of Gaunt, who would later marry Peter's daughter Constanza, and a substantial English force across the Pyrenees. At the Battle of Najera, on April 3, 1367, the English and Castilian forces routed Henry's army and its French allies. Henry fled to France. Peter returned to his throne. It did not hold. Peter never paid his debts to the Black Prince, who withdrew from France ill and furious. Charles V once again funded Henry's return. Henry came back in 1368. Peter's support had eroded further. In March 1369, besieged in the castle of Montiel in the southern Castilian plain, Peter attempted to escape through an intermediary and was instead led into a trap. On March 23, 1369, Peter and Henry met face to face in a tent at Montiel. They grappled. Henry or one of his men stabbed Peter to death. It was a regicide, the murder of a reigning anointed king. A medieval political theory treated such acts with the utmost gravity. Henry II, now the first of the Trastamara dynasty, immediately set about constructing the historical narrative that would justify what he had done. The Chronicles of Peter the Cruel, the monster of Castile, the murderer of his queen, the friend of Moors and Jews, the enemy of the Christian order. Ayala's chronicle was the primary instrument of this construction. It served its purpose extraordinarily well, and Blanche of Bourbon's suffering was near the center of it. The daughters of María de Padilla. The daughters of Peter I and María de Padilla, the children whose legitimacy Peter had fought to establish at Blanche's expense, went on to remarkable destinies that wove the tragedy of Blanche of Bourbon into the bloodlines of European royalty for generations. Costanza, born in 1354, spent years in English custody after her father's flight. In September 1371, she married John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the third surviving son of Edward III. John of Gaunt's first wife, Blanche of Lancaster, commemorated by Geoffrey Chaucer in the Book of the Duchess, had died in 1368. By marrying Costanza, John of Gaunt assumed the title of King of Castile and Leon in right of his wife, since Costanza was, in the Petrine legitimist view, the de jure queen of Castile. He pursued this claim vigorously for years, though he never managed to take the Castilian throne. Costanza and John of Gaunt had a daughter, Catherine of Lancaster, born in 1373. Catherine's destiny was among the most consequential of the entire Blanche of Bourbon story's long aftermath. In 1388, she married Henry III of Castile, the grandson of Henry of Trastamara, the man who had killed her grandfather Peter. This was one of the great dynastic reconciliations of medieval Iberia. By joining the Petrine line through Costanza and Catherine with the Trastamaran line through Henry III, it healed the wound of the Civil War and merged the rival bloodlines into a single legitimate succession. All subsequent Castilian monarchs, through the 15th century, through Ferdinand and Isabella, through the Habsburg emperors who inherited Spain, descended from this union. Costanza's sister Isabel, born in 1355, married Edmund of Langley, first Duke of York, another son of Edward III, in 1371. Their grandson, Richard, Duke of York, was the father of Edward IV and Richard III. The blood of Peter I of Castile runs into the English royal family through this line, connecting the tragedy of Blanche and Peter all the way to the Wars of the Roses, and to every English monarch since Henry VII. The ironies here compound almost beyond bearing. The children produced by Peter's insistence on María Padilla over Blanche of Bourbon went on to populate the royal families of England and Castile. The House of Bourbon, descended from Blanche's own brother Louis II's line, eventually rose to rule France and Spain. The dynasties that Peter's cruelty served and undermined ultimately merged in the deep genealogical time of European royalty into a single vast network of descent. Part 7. Memory, Myth, and the Limits of Knowing. How Blanche was remembered. Blanche of Bourbon's story entered the cultural memory of France and Spain almost immediately after her death, but the retellings were always shaped by purposes other than simple fidelity to fact, and the gap between the Blanche of legend and the Blanche of history is itself an important part of the history. For Henry of Trastamara's propaganda effort, her story was invaluable. Henry needed to justify the killing of an anointed king, an act that violated the deepest medieval prohibitions. The most effective justification was to establish that Peter had placed himself outside the bounds of legitimate kingship entirely, that the usual rules did not apply to so monstrous a ruler. The murder of Blanche, beautiful, innocent, blameless, royal, was a perfect exhibit on this case. Ayala's chronicle made her suffering central to the portrait of Peter the Cruel, and later accounts amplified the image further. From France, the story took a different but equally interesting shape. French accounts portrayed Blanche as a royal martyr, a princess of French blood sacrificed on the altar of Spanish barbarism. Her kinship with the French royal house, her Bourbon connections, her death without justice or children, all of this served as evidence of French civilization's moral superiority and the savagery of the foreign king who had destroyed her. This reading, of course, quietly elided the fact that France had sent her to Castile, failed to pay her dowry, failed to protect her through 8 years of captivity, and never mounted any serious effort to compel her release. Memory, as always, was selective. The comparison with Margaret of Burgundy, the wife of Louis X, who was imprisoned and died in 1315 in the Tourdinel affair, was drawn by contemporaries and sustained by later writers. Both women represented the queen unjustly destroyed by royal male power, their stories functioning as laments about the fragility of female life in court politics. The crucial difference was that Margaret was at least credibly accused of adultery, while Blanche's accusers were transparently acting in bad faith. As the Bourbon dynasty rose to the French throne in 1589 with Henry IV, there was fresh dynastic motivation to sanctify Blanche's memory. Her suffering reflected well on the Bourbon line, casting them as a family capable of producing martyrs and saints alongside kings. A dynasty that had taken the French crown only by force of arms and whose claim remained contested, was not unhappy to have a sainted ancestry in its genealogy. The Spanish tradition approached Blanche more ambivalently, as it had to. Peter I of Castile was simultaneously a historical villain and a figure of genuine complexity with real defenders, and Spanish historiography could not simply adopt the French narrative of saintly Blanche and monstrous Peter without doing violence to the actual record. The result was a more nuanced tradition that acknowledged Peter's political achievements alongside his cruelty and treated Blanche as a genuine victim without requiring her to be a plaster saint. The historian's problem. The fundamental challenge in recovering Blanche of Bourbon is one that recurs throughout the study of medieval women's lives. The sources were not written for her benefit, were not interested in her as a person, and were shaped by agendas that had nothing to do with accuracy about her experience or her agency. Pedro Lopez de Ayala is not a simple liar. He was a sophisticated political observer who had actually served at Peter's court before defecting to Henry's side, and his chronicle contains details that cannot be easily dismissed as wholesale invention. But he wrote under Trastamaran patronage, and his portrait of Peter is systematically damning in ways that served his patrons. His account of Blanche's death, the physician's refusal, the crossbowman, the execution of Reboletto, has the texture of something that may incorporate genuine court knowledge, filtered through years of political realignment. But it was composed after Henry had won, and it must be read with that fact constantly in mind. The pro-patron sources are even more transparently motivated. The claim that the marriage was validly annulled in 1354, that Blanche's imprisonment was a legal separation rather than captivity, that she died of illness rather than murder, all of it serves so neatly to absolve Peter that the apologetic narrative seems constructed rather than observed. The absence of any independent corroboration, the convenient timing of key claims, the way each detail resolves precisely in Peter's favor. These are not the marks of honest testimony. Clara Esto's 1995 study, Pedro the Cruel of Castile, represents the most rigorous attempt to move past both the black legend and the white legend, to situate Peter in the actual social, economic, and political context of his reign, and to acknowledge that he was neither a uniquely terrible monster nor a misunderstood saint, but a man of his century, operating according to the brutal logic of medieval kingship in a kingdom that was trying to destroy him. Blanche, in this reading, functioned more as a symbolic figure in dynastic propaganda than as a fully recoverable historical actor. The scant independent evidence, no papal bulls addressed to her personally, no Bourbon family correspondence, no testimony from people who actually knew her, means that the historical Blanche remains almost entirely out of reach. This absence of evidence is itself evidence. Blanche was not permitted to leave traces. She was denied the freedom to act, to write, to build the kinds of relationships and create the kinds of records that gives historical figures their legibility to later generations. She was held in suspension, and the suspension was thorough enough to efface her as an individual even from a world that acknowledged her as a queen. Part 8. What we can know and what it means. A girl was born in 1339 in central France, the second daughter of a family so thoroughly rooted in the Capetian royal tradition that her ancestry was inseparable from the ancestry of France itself. She grew up in comfortable ducal courts among sisters who would become queens, in a household where the cultivation of piety and the management of prestige were the primary arts. She learned to pray. She probably learned to read. She learned courtly manners in the running of a large household. She was raised for the role she was eventually assigned, the role of a queen, which in the 14th century meant primarily the role of diplomatic instrument and reproductive vessel for legitimate heirs. She refused the role, or tried to. 3 times she refused the marriage to the King of Castile, and 3 times the adults around her overrode her refusal. Whatever her reasons, they were insufficient to the strategic needs of the kingdom, which required her compliance and did not require her consent. She acquiesced. She traveled for months through foreign landscapes, stopping to receive the blessing of a pope who seems to have recognized that she deserved better than what was coming. She arrived in Castile in February 1353, 14 years old, carrying 12 trunks and a gold crown and a tiara set with rubies and emeralds and diamonds. Her husband was not there to meet her. He came eventually, married her in a ceremony of calculated splendor, stayed 2 days, and left. A chronicler records that after those 2 days, he never saw the queen Donna Blanche, his wife, again. For 8 years after that, she was a prisoner, not in a dungeon, probably in rooms of some comfort, with attendants and religious observance, in residences appropriate to her rank, but unable to leave, unable to govern, unable to correspond freely, unable to bear children, unable to exercise any of the functions that gave a medieval queen her purpose and her standing. She was moved from castle to castle as political circumstances shifted. The world knew about her, in the way that European courts tracked the fates of royal women. The French crown appealed on her behalf. The Pope made representations. Both were ignored. The cost of actually forcing Peter to change his behavior always outweighed the benefit. She was too small a matter for the great powers of Europe, busy with their wars and ransoms and succession crises, to sacrifice anything real. Then, in August 1361, she died in Medina Sidonia at 22, within weeks of the death of María de Padilla, the woman who had replaced her, just in time for Peter to move to legitimize the children he had not been able to officially recognize while his canonically legitimate wife was still alive. Whether she was murdered, as the hostile chronicles insist, or died of illness, as Peter's defenders claim, or died by some darker combination of neglect and despair, cannot finally be resolved. What can be said is that her death was convenient, that it occurred in conditions of deliberate isolation, and that it was followed immediately by the political moves it made possible. She left no children, no buildings, no letters, no documented friendships, no policy, no patronage. The magnificent trousseau she brought from France, the crowns and tiara, and 12 trunks, ended up in the possession of a kingdom that never wanted her. The properties promised in the marriage contract were never fully transferred to her, and after her death, they reverted to the crown, as the contract had specified. Blanche of Bourbon brought 300,000 gold florins worth of diplomatic value to Castile, and received in return 8 years of captivity in uncertain grave. Her burial site is not definitively established. She was associated in later tradition with the Church of Santo Domingo el Rio in Toledo, a Dominican convent that served as a royal burial place. There may have been subsequent transfers of her remains. The exact location where she lies is unknown. Even in death, she could not hold her place. And yet something persisted. The story was not entirely suppressed. Poets wrote laments for her, those shaped according to their own needs rather than her reality. Chroniclers recorded her, though filtered through their political agendas. The Bourbon dynasty remembered her, though as a useful symbol rather than a fully human ancestor. And now, centuries later, historians and writers continue to return to her story, trying to recover what can be recovered, acknowledging what cannot, sitting with the weight of the injustice done to her. Medieval royal marriage was a machinery that consumed individuals in the service of dynastic goals. The children it moved across the board of European politics were expected to perform their roles without complaint, bear the consequences of other people's decisions without recourse, and disappear without protest when they ceased to serve the purposes for which they had been deployed. Most of them did. Most of them were forgotten. Blanche is not entirely forgotten, but she is almost forgotten, which in certain ways is worse, known just enough for the outlines of her suffering to be visible, not well enough for her to emerge as a full human being. The questions her life poses are not medieval questions. They are the questions of any era in which power treats people as instruments. What is a human life worth when it has become inconvenient to the powerful? What obligations do the great political systems of any age owe to the individuals caught in their mechanisms? When the kings and diplomats and papal legates agreed that Blanche's situation was unfortunate, but not worth the cost of changing, what does that tell us about what any political order actually values when its stated principles and its practical interests diverge? Medieval examples have a particular clarity the castles, the crowns, the crossbow, the 12 trunks. They cut through the usual fog of complexity and show us the basic mechanism with unusual sharpness. A girl was used as a tool. The tool was discarded, and the machine moved on. Blanche of Bourbon, Queen of Castile, born 1339, died 1361.